One of the biggest problems that I see as it relates to health and wellness and fitness is how extreme everything is, especially online. And that was a lot, has a lot to do with how, or my decision to start this channel. Because granted, there's a lot of good content out there, but I found like so much of it was either 3 hours of very good, dense information though. And I'll just be honest, I'm not going to sit through a 3 hour podcast. Or, maybe stuff is a little bit more digestible, but they're covering, topics in such an extreme way and, talking about diet and, you need to be a carnivore and you can't eat anything else and you should never eat anything else or don't ever eat a seed oil again and otherwise you're going to die. And so I felt like, maybe talking about my approach, which is a little bit different than that, would be helpful. And that's what got me wanting to, starting to create content. And, this is a little bit of a different format for me. And usually I'm indoors, I've got a studio set up and I use an outline. Again, I'm talking about oftentimes, somewhat complex issues or medical studies or things like that. And so I want to make sure I don't misquote a statistic or a study. And so I go off an outline, but I realize it can appear scripted at times. And because this is a little bit more of a personal discussion today, I thought that this is a little bit of a better format. I fully intended to do this actually on a walk. I love going on walks, and I was going to go on a walk with my wife today, and it was beautiful. I mean, it's still beautiful now. It was the weather was awesome earlier, but you might hear some thunder in the background. It looks like it may start raining, and so I figured it was a little bit safer to do this at home. But what I want to talk about today is, again, my overall view of health and wellness and fitness, and how it impacts how I advise patients and friends, as well as what my journey has looked like. And so, I think back to the time period, basically from the time I was 18 until I was 30 or maybe even 33. And I was so focused on my career at that point and family to some extent as well, between undergrad and then medical school and residency, and then the first few years out of residency working as an attending, that I really neglected my health and I let it suffer. And and when you're in your 20s, you can get away with a lot, right? You can stay up too late and maybe, overindulge with alcohol and it doesn't seem to really have a big impact, or you can eat like garbage and it doesn't really impact you all that much. But over time, these things, they add up. And the turning point for me was when I was 33 years old. I'd gone on vacation with my family and we're down in Florida and on the beach, my swimsuit. And I saw this picture of myself with my son and with my shirt off. And I was like, is that how I actually look? Like it was, and I wasn't obese at the time. Let's be, I want to be honest here, but I would call it, skinny fat slash dad bod. The irony is I actually weigh the same amount now, or maybe a little bit more than I did then. But I wasn't happy with what I saw. And something that, you know, I remembered at that moment was when I was in residency. We had this lecture from the immediate past president from the American College of Emergency Physicians. I'm an ER doctor by training, as an aside. And the title of the lecture, and I remember because it stuck out to me so much because, here I'm in residency. I haven't even started my career yet. And it was, planning your exit strategy. And the fundamental premise of this was this idea that, you're not going to work as an ER doctor forever. So what are you going to plan to do otherwise? But also talking about some of these things like health and fitness. And a comment that he made, that this is what I really remembered, is he said, listen, you can be at kind of the upper limit of normal for your weight when you finish residency. But if you gain just a pound a year for 20 years, at that point in time, you're going to be obese. And looking at myself at the time again, even though I wasn't obese, recognizing the trajectory I was on and where I was headed really motivated me to say, I need to start making some changes in my life. And there were a lot of changes that needed to be made. You know, I was, I'll give you some examples. So I would get off work and maybe I was doing like a swing shift and I get off at midnight and I'd go to the grocery store, I'd walk in a Tom Thumb and I would literally buy a birthday cake and go home at the end of my shift, and I was hungry and I was tired, and I would eat half a cake before I went to bed, and many times the other half when I got up in the morning. And I think we can agree, birthday cake's awesome, but there's no world where eating an entire cake and within like probably like a 8-hour setting is gonna be healthy for anybody. And so, those are some easy changes for me to make. But at that time when I first started my journey, you hear that adage where they say like, "Oh, you can't outrun a bad diet." And I was very much an example of this. That I still wasn't eating very healthy and thinking, "Oh, I can just work it off at the gym." And I would go to the gym, it started once a week, but I would go on Saturday nights and think that, well, I'm going to do 90 minutes or 60 minutes on the stair climber at level 15, the maximum level. And look, it says I burned 1,000 calories or 1,100 calories, and so that just that kind of absolves me of the sins of the garbage that I'd eaten all week long. Putting aside the fact that I didn't really understand zone two training, and it really probably wasn't going to help me take off the fat anyway. But it was a it was a start. And that's really, I mentioned I want to talk about how I approach things, but going back to the idea of how extreme everything is, what I advise people and what I found worked for me is small incremental changes that I can commit to and stick with. Because I look at my life today and how I try to, live a healthier life. 10 years ago, if someone had told me this is what you need to do, I'd say, I'm not doing any of it then. It doesn't make any sense. I'm done. But the reality is, it's about progress and not perfection. It's about you getting there over time and just sticking it out. And even I look at the evolution for myself of exercise and fitness and how I started with the stair climber and then eventually incorporated weight training and then moved into doing jujitsu, which I still train jujitsu. And it was an evolution of finding what worked for me. And just thinking about this, this conversation I had with a nutritionist when I was on a flight, and she's telling me, "Oh, you can never," I was talking about the fact that I do intermittent fasting, oftentimes. Part of it's just because my schedule's so busy, as well as the fact I really like to eat a lot of meat. And she's like, "Oh, that's terrible. That's never good." And to say that that's terrible is like telling that two patients that a medication is going to work identically in both of them. It's about finding what works for that patient, because sometimes you start, you think one medication is going to work and you realize it's not and you have to try something else. Well, it's the same thing with working out. People are, all of our bodies are different. We're going to respond differently. Same thing with the diet. Certain people can literally get away with, they've got faster metabolism, whatever you want to call it. And they can get away with eating things that others couldn't. So it's really about finding what works for you and experimenting. And again, this theme of just these small incremental changes over time that you can commit to and stick with. And so I really just, again, I wanted to put this out there as a way of explaining my approach to things. Even, are things like, diet was the one other area I was going to touch on. That, yes, I've improved in a lot of ways, but things like, the seed oils, for example, I still have seed oils, right? It happens. I still, again, I eat the French fries off my wife's out of my wife's, you know, meal from Whataburger. I still do those things, but I just don't make it a part of my daily habit, right? I treat it as a treat. And I think that ultimately, to have the greatest success, it really just does just come down to starting somewhere and committing to it and sticking with it. And that seems to be the best path forward for people to, have the greatest impact over time on their life and their wellness and fitness and, lifespan and health span. And so I hope you found this helpful. I'm going to say inspiring, but at least give you maybe some motivation that there's a way that's more reasonable and that it doesn't have to be so extreme. And I'd also be curious, as I said, this content, because or this format that I'm trying to do right now lends itself to something a little bit more impromptu like this. But I'd be really curious to hear if this resonates with you, and perhaps I can find a way to maybe blend this with some of the other types of content that I'm creating, just to make it seem a little bit more impromptu. again, I hope you found this helpful and, wherever your health and wellness journey takes you. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks.